Hello class. Today we're going to be breaking down how to get better at competitive Pokemon as quickly as possible. Now I want to start with a disclaimer that this is not everyone's goal, nor should it be. In fact, I myself did a lot of things that I'm about to tell you not to do in this video. For example, I suggest that new players don't build their own teams when they're starting out. I did build my own teams because I love team building and it was the most fun part of the game for me. Did it slow my progress? Yes, probably. But I had a lot of fun. For the vast majority of people, there is no rush to become better at competitive Pokemon. However, for some people, it is fun for them to try and improve as quickly as possible. Optimizing their learning speed and progress is part of the fun. Others maybe aren't as dedicated to speedy improvement, but would still like a roadmap of how to improve that they can follow at their leisure. Those are the kinds of people that this video is for. There are a ton of videos out there explaining how to improve at competitive Pokemon, many on my channel, but if you try to focus on all of them at once and try to implement them all, you're going to be overwhelmed and probably not improve as quickly as you'd like. The purpose of this video is basically to create a timeline for what you should focus on at each level and how to practice to ensure you're improving as quickly as you can and not stagnating. For examples and background footage, I'll be using the main format for competitive singles, Scarlet and Violet Overused, but the advice I give is relevant for almost every format. The site this format is played on is Pokemon Showdown, by far the largest competitive Pokemon site. If you're not familiar, I've linked Pokemon Showdown in the description. I'd suggest you familiarize yourself with it before we continue, as much of my advice in this video will depend on at least a basic understanding of Pokemon Showdown. I've also included a link to a video explaining everything you need to know about Pokemon Showdown. Check that out if needed. Now, back to discussing how to get good at competitive Pokemon as quickly as possible. I'm going to break down the stages that Pokemon players go through based on approximate ELO ranges. In Scarlet and Violet Overused, the ladder starts at 1000 ELO, and the top person on the ladder is usually somewhere between 2000 and 2200 ELO. I've broken players down into 4 stages. First, the information stage, which is typically around 1000 to 1250 ELO. Second, the early competitive stage, which is around 1250 to 1500 ELO. Third, the middle competitive stage, which is around 1500 to 1750 ELO. And fourth, the advanced competitive stage, which is 1750 plus ELO. These ranges are based on Scarlet and Violet Overused, one of the most active ladders. In formats with fewer players, 1600 ELO might be the absolute top player, so feel free to adjust this scale to better fit the tier you play. But also be warned, a lower maximum ELO indicates fewer players on the ladder, and the fewer players there are, typically the less competitive that format is in general. If you really want to get a good idea of how strong of a player you are, you'll want to participate in the most popular and active ladders. Now, for each of these levels, I'm going to explain what you should be doing to improve as quickly as possible, as well as common mistakes people make at that level. Before we get into it, one final disclaimer: some of the methods for improvement that I go over in this video are opinions, not tested facts. Improving at competitive Pokemon is not an exact science, and different players have different opinions on what the best way is to improve. That being said, I've personally been playing competitive Pokemon for nearly 10 years now, and I've tutored hundreds of people at many different levels of play. So although my opinion is one of many, it is a well thought out and well educated opinion that has helped many players get results and improve. Now let's get right into it, starting with the first stage, the information stage. Players at this stage typically don't have a good understanding of the game itself. Maybe they don't understand how EVs and IVs work. They probably don't know what a lot of items do. They don't grasp how stat boosting works. They might be confused by damage rolls. They probably struggle to automatically tell how the type chart works. Similar struggles of that nature. Some people that have played Pokemon games their entire life, even if they've only recently joined the competitive scene, can actually skip this stage entirely. Having lots of in-game experience is actually a massive help in the competitive scene. People that grow up with Pokemon often take for granted how much you have to know, simply to even have a chance at being good at competitive Pokemon. To even reach the second stage, you typically need to have the type chart mostly memorized, approximate damage rolls memorized, understand lots of speed tiers, know what certain abilities do, know which Pokemon often use what moves, know which items are popular and how they all function. It's a lot. If you don't have a lot of in-game experience and your first experience with Pokemon is the competitive scene, this stage is going to take you a very long time. Even if you play for hours every day, you'll be at this first stage for at least several months. There's just a ton to know. So what should you be doing at this stage? The biggest thing is just to play a ton of games. There is no way to learn all the information without experiencing it. And the fastest way to get to the second stage is just doing that, playing hundreds or thousands of games on the ladder. And as you would guess, the more hours you spend playing, the faster you'll improve, unless you play so much that fatigues and wears you out. There's no way to avoid playing tons of games, but there are things that can help speed the learning process up. One website that can help speed this learning process is MunchStats. This website shows usage stats for many formats, including common EV spreads, abilities, move pools, and more. If you see an unfamiliar Pokemon when you're playing, you can search it up here and see what it does. You'll eventually learn what Pokemon do through experience anyway, but quick research using sites like this can speed that process up. I'll have that linked in the description. While we're on the topic of MunchStats, I want to address another popular tool called Shodex. This is a browser extension that can be added to Pokemon Showdown. It automatically shows how much damage attacks do based on the set of your Pokemon and the automatically input most popular set of your opponent's Pokemon. This tool can be a good way to help learn approximately how much damage Pokemon do to each other. Having a sense for how much damage certain attacks do is one of the most important things to learn in this information gathering stage. Any kind of long-term strategy is impossible to do without knowing approximately how much damage attacks are going to do in a game. This sense of how much damage attacks will do is called head calcs in the community, and some have expressed concern that using Shodex might slow the development of head calcs, since you can always just check the damage rolls right there. This is a valid concern. I'd suggest using Shodex. I think it's a great tool, but you should change the settings so that it appears in the battle window. This means you'll have a button that can open and close Shodex. If you don't know how much damage something does, take a guess, then open Shodex and see how close you are. And once you see the damage, close it again. Using Shodex in this way is like using flashcards to learn a different language. The best strategy is to look at the flashcards, then put them away and see how much you remember. You, of course, won't memorize as well if you're always just looking at the flashcards. If you want more information on this tool, I have a full video breaking down Shodex linked in the description. The next thing we want to think about: what team or teams should you use? I suggest using sample teams. These teams are built by high-level players, and they're proven to be at least moderately successful. They're all public and can easily be found online. Just search up on Google sample teams and then the name of whatever format you're playing. If that format has a room on Pokemon Showdown, you can also go into that room and type /rfacS in the chat to see sample teams. Sample teams aren't the only option. There's also a Rate My Team forum where people post teams, so you can pick teams that performed well on the ladder and get the importable links to the teams there. I'll link this forum in the description as well. In the competitive Pokemon community, using teams made by other people isn't seen as stealing. It's encouraged and often seen as flattering to the original builder. The reason I suggest using sample teams at this stage is that if you build your own teams, that team is pretty much guaranteed to be absolutely terrible. If you're using a good team and you play well, you win. If you play poorly, you'll probably lose. This will reinforce good habits and help you start to develop a basic sense of strategy. But if your team is awful and is holding you back even if you play well, it's more difficult to develop that basic level of strategy. At this stage, it's okay to stick to one team and really learn how to play it well. It's also okay to change up teams and have a group of 2 to 5 that you like playing. I would try to stay below 6 teams, though. If you have too many teams in rotation, it'll be difficult to develop a deeper understanding of how any of the teams function. The only important thing here is that you don't pick a stall or hyper offense team as your only team. Sample teams are often sorted by archetype, but in case you're not sure if your team is a stall or hyper offense, here's an easy method. If your team has 6 bulky Pokemon, it's a stall team. If your team has 6 offensive Pokemon and lots of stat boosting moves, it's a hyper offense team. The reason I suggest you stay away from these teams is that they don't effectively teach a wide range of strategic thinking. It's important to play using both offensive and defensive Pokemon, balancing them on a team and learning how they work together. Using Stall or Hyper Offense denies the experience of using certain types of Pokemon. These two archetypes are also just much easier to play than other archetypes. Especially at a lower level, you can have a lot of success with Stall simply by switching pre-planned walls into the threat they're meant to stop, and repeating that every turn until you win. Similarly, Hyper Offense teams often have a dedicated lead and a series of powerful sweepers that can often win the game even if you play poorly or throw Pokemon away unnecessarily. There's nothing wrong with playing these archetypes sometimes. In fact, it's a good idea to play every archetype at least a little bit, especially as we get to the later stages, but if you play Stall or Hyper Offense exclusively, you may develop a sort of Pokemon brain rot, where you learn to play almost the same way every game without thinking. Another big mistake I see is watching too many guide videos instead of just playing. The mere fact that you're watching this video might be an indicator that you have this problem. The only way to get better is by battling a lot on the ladder. That's pretty much it. Guide videos, tutorials, even watching gameplay from pros isn't a substitute for practicing on your own. Guide videos do have a place. They can provide direction and give you an idea of how to practice, what to focus on, or help correct errors in your playing or thinking, but the vast majority of the time, at least 90%, should be spent actually battling and playing the game. One more mistake I sometimes see, particularly with these Stage 1 players, is playing against your friends instead of playing on the ladder. This one is really common. Now, there's nothing wrong with challenging your friends to battles, but the vast majority of your practice should be against random opponents on the ladder. The ladder sorts you with people at your skill level, which helps you grow. It also gives you varied opponents with different teams and different ways of playing, so you learn to deal with many play styles and many Pokemon rather than just learning how to play against your friends and the Pokemon they prefer to use. I know the point system can be stressful for some people, but trust me, the ladder is the absolute best place to practice. So, in summary, the best way to move past this first stage as fast as possible is to play a ton of ladder games using 1 to 5 sample teams or forum teams. As for tools, you can search up unfamiliar Pokemon on sites like Munchstats, and you can use CalcDex, but make sure to keep it hidden most of the time. Don't spend too much time watching guide videos instead of actually playing, don't try to build your own teams, don't play Stall or Hyper Offense too much, and don't just play against your friends. The vast majority of your practice should be on the ladder. This first stage can take a while to get past, but with time, everybody is capable of moving on to Stage 2, the early competitive stage. Before we discuss Stage 2, if you're getting something out of this video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps out a lot. Alright, so now you've made it to Stage 2. If you make it here, you should be proud. Most players in the community sadly consider this low ladder and call these players bad. I'm guilty of this at times myself. But the truth is, if you've made it here, you're better than 99% of Pokemon players at competitive Pokemon. You should be proud, and it is a big accomplishment. If you're at Stage 2, you now understand how the game works, and you've memorized an insane amount of information about tons of Pokemon and mechanics. This is where players often start to develop higher level strategies beyond just basic prediction. They'll start to consider positioning, have long-term plans, and they'll start to memorize not just what Pokemon do, but common interactions that Pokemon have. So, how do you get past this stage as quickly as possible? Well, a lot is the same as before. The best way, once again, is to play a ton of games. And once again, I do suggest sample teams. Even though you've had a ton of practice by this point, very few players in this ELO range have a deep enough understanding of team structure to build a decent team. Anything you build would probably still be terrible and hold you back from developing as quickly as you could be. I would say though, if you were only using one team in Stage 1, it's time to branch out of it. Try having a set of 3 to 5 teams at any given time, ideally with archetype variation. Like with the previous stage, I also suggest not exclusively playing Stall or Hyper Offense. And you can continue using CalcDex the same way, having it closed most of the time so you can work on developing those head calcs. The big thing to watch out for in this second stage is that you don't start habit playing, or as it's also called, autopiloting. you've just spent months or years in Stage 1, memorizing a crazy amount of information. Memorization is a huge part of competitive Pokemon. The natural next step after memorizing information is memorizing interactions. For example, you learned in Stage 1 that Moltres is a fire and flying type, and it has Flame Body, which can burn Pokemon that use contact moves. You also learned in Stage 1 that Great Tusk uses a lot of contact moves and often doesn't have a move that can do any significant damage to Moltres. Stage 2 is where you put together that Moltres is a good switch-in to Great Tusk. It may sound silly and obvious when looking at just one example like this, and of course, players do start to realize which Pokemon answer other Pokemon in Stage 1, but Stage 2 is really where players start to understand and get used to these interactions on a large scale. They'll start to learn how to respond to almost every Pokemon they see, sometimes even developing a sequence of turns to respond to certain threats. This interaction learning is slightly format specific, but probably not as much as you'd think. Sure, if you change from Scarlet and Violet overused to Scarlet and Violet underused, you'll have to relearn some interactions as you'll be dealing with different Pokemon. This adjustment, though, isn't nearly as bad as you might think. Walls often behave in a similar way, as do sweepers, as do breakers. Even if the pool of Pokemon you're dealing with changes, this understanding of interactions that you develop in Stage 2 will transfer very quickly. Memorizing these interactions is a very good thing. Understanding what counters what, how to typically respond to threats, and how common interactions play out is a vital step in becoming better. But it also poses a danger. Some players memorize interactions and then proceed to never or almost never deviate from those sequences that they memorize. Moltres is a very solid switch into Great Tusk almost all the time. But what if you're using a team that has a physically defensive Hatterene that could potentially punish a Great Tusk even harder if you switch in with Hatterene when the Great Tusk is using Stealth Rock, so you can bounce them back with Magic Bounce? If you suspect the Great Tusk might use Stealth Rock, Hatterene probably is the best switch-in. But if you've fallen victim to habit playing or autopiloting, you'll probably just go into Moltres every time without thinking. This is such a common issue because habit plays are often good plays, just not the best play. If you notice yourself making plays too quickly and without thinking, that means you're habit playing. I have a whole video breaking this down linked in the description if you want more information, but the main thing to keep in mind is you should be actively thinking every turn. In Stage 1, your brain was probably overwhelmed by the massive amount of information you had to synthesize. In Stage 2, though, you have the mental space now to think about the game in front of you, strategize, consider creative options. The best way to get past Stage 2 as quickly as possible is, once again, to play a ton of games, but this time really make sure you're actively thinking every turn. Even if those thoughts are nonsensical or leading you to straight-up terrible plays, that's okay. As long as you're actively thinking, you're improving. In other words, the thoughts don't have to be necessarily good or correct thoughts, there just need to be thoughts there. If you autopilot, you largely stop improving. Stage 2 is also the first stage where I recommend analyzing your replays. On Showdown after a battle, you can download or save the replay and watch it at any speed you like, pausing, going back and forward, and such. So why not review replays earlier? Why not review replays in Stage 1? Well, if you try to review replays at Stage 1, you're probably just torturing yourself. Nearly every play you make in Stage 1 is going to be bad or at least non-optimal, so poring over replays and looking at all of your mistakes isn't super helpful. You just want to play more games and keep learning what Pokemon do and how the game works. At Stage 2, though, you have enough knowledge and you've developed enough of a grasp on basic strategy for replay review to be helpful. It's sometimes hard to tell what you were doing wrong in the game itself, and rewatching a replay without the stress of the live battle can be very revealing. You can also ask a high-level player to watch your replay and give their thoughts. They might have useful insights and see things you missed. I would caution you, though, don't spend too much time reviewing replays. Particularly difficult games, or games where you're not sure what went wrong, can be very helpful to review, but most of the time, as I said, around 90% should still be spent battling. You don't need to painstakingly review every game you play. So let's summarize. At Stage 2, the new things you should be doing to improve as quickly as possible is using 3 to 5 sample teams, ideally of different archetypes, saving replays and analyzing difficult games, and really focusing on actively thinking every turn. And like before, you should play a ton of games on the ladder, keep using calc decks, and like before, mostly keep it hidden. You should not habit play or autopilot. This is the biggest way people stagnate at this stage and all of the following stages. And like before, all of the things I told you to avoid still apply. Don't spend too much time watching guide videos, don't try to build your own teams yet, don't excessively play stall or hyper offense, and don't avoid the ladder. It's the best place to practice. As you can see on the graphic, I've made the text gray if the item on the list isn't new. This will help show you how the best approach to speedy improvement changes throughout the 4 stages. So with enough practice games, as long as you actively think and don't habit play, you'll get to stage 3, the middle competitive stage. You're now at the point where you've memorized all the Pokemon information from stage 1, and you've learned a lot of common interactions in stage 2. And like before, to continue improving, a lot of the things you want to do are the same. You should keep using Calc Decks the same way. You should keep playing a variety of teams. And like all the other strategies, improvement will involve playing a ton of games on the ladder. But there are 2 major differences at this stage, 2 big ways you should change your approach to keep growing as quickly as possible. The first is that it's time to start building your own teams. This is a bit of a controversial one. Some fairly high-level players barely ever team build and just get teams from people they know or from forums. But you'll notice that all of the best players are strong builders as well. I know of no exceptions. Building teams makes you a better battler in many ways. First of all, you'll probably play teams that you built yourself better, since you understand the intentions behind why every Pokemon was added and how the team is supposed to function. Building teams also gives you a deeper understanding of team compositions in general, making it easier to predict what sets your opponent is running just based on the Pokemon they have. It can also improve performance because your teams aren't publicly available. Using sample teams does ensure high quality, but your opponents may know your team, and your opponent knowing all of your sets is a pretty huge disadvantage. But why now? Why didn't I tell you to start team building earlier if it's so helpful? Well, first of all, now you know enough about the tier and enough about the game that you can probably build a decent team, one that isn't going to be so bad that it makes you constantly lose even if you play well. And secondly, even if you do build some awful teams, which you definitely will at first, you probably have enough experience now to tell when a loss is because you played poorly versus when your team just let you down. I should also note that it's still okay to use teams other people send you or still use sample teams. There's nothing wrong with that. It won't slow your progress, but I would suggest using teams you built yourself at least half of the time to ensure your team building skills improve alongside your battling. So, start team building. That's the first big thing to implement in stage 3. The second big thing to implement is middle ground plays. This basically means instead of trying to predict what your opponent is going to do or making plays based on vibes or past experience of similar situations, you ask yourself, what are the likely plays my opponent could make? And then you make a play that covers as many of their options as possible while also weighing the risk and reward of being right or wrong. I have an entire video breaking down how to make middle ground plays that I'll link in the description, but to go over it quickly here, the first step is determine your opponent's likely plays. What buttons might they reasonably click? The second step is to weigh your own possible options, decisions that generally look good, into the pool of options your opponent has. And the third step is to pick one of those choices based on how many of your opponent's options are covered and the risk and reward. Good players make middle ground plays most turns. This is a fact. Even the most aggressive top-level players that go for the most explosive plays and reads are still making middle ground plays most turns. There are turns where you do need to make predictions. You do need to make hard reads and pick big swings. If you're losing a game, you might need to go for hard reads to have even a chance at winning. And in general, just to avoid becoming too predictable, you don't want to go for middle ground plays every turn. Throwing in some predictions into your playstyle is a good idea. But in most games, you will be making middle ground plays most turns. So it's absolutely vital to master this skill if you want to improve and become a top-level player. I see a lot of people try really hard to implement middle ground plays before they get to this stage, and while that doesn't do any lasting harm, it can slow you down. If you're in stage 1, it's basically impossible to make middle ground plays. How can you possibly weigh the risk and reward of certain outcomes if you don't know the type chart, or you don't know how much damage attacks are going to do? It can't be done. Trying to make middle ground plays in stage 1 is just adding unnecessary mental load. Similarly, in stage 2, how are you going to make middle ground plays if you can't do the first step? Remember, the first step is knowing your opponent's likely plays. You're not going to know your opponent's likely plays until you have a deep understanding of common interactions. But by stage 3, you have the raw information from stage 1 and the understanding of interactions from stage 2, so you can start effectively making middle ground plays. That's not to say you can't make good plays that cover multiple options before stage 3, you definitely can. I'm just saying not to make it the main focus of your efforts. Stage 1 should be about learning how the game works, learning what Pokemon do, and stage 2 should be about learning interactions and basic strategy. That's more than enough to focus on if your goal is improving as quickly as possible. Trying to learn too much at once just slows you down. The biggest risk of stagnating at stage 3 is once again habit playing or autopiloting. Make sure you're actively thinking. Going through the process of making middle ground plays is a good way to force yourself to actively think. As you get more comfortable with middle ground plays, it will start to become automatic. It may really burn up your time at first, but eventually you'll be able to spot solid mid-ground plays in seconds. So, to summarize, to improve as quickly as possible if you're at stage 3, you should build your own teams for the most part and focus on implementing middle ground plays. And, as before, analyze replays, make sure you're actively thinking, play a ton of ladder games, use calc decks. There are no new don'ts. Habit playing or autopiloting is still the biggest risk for stagnation. You still shouldn't spend a lot of time on guide videos, you still shouldn't exclusively play stall or hyper offense, and you definitely should still be playing on the ladder. It's the best place to practice. If you follow this advice, with enough practice, you'll reach stage 4, the advanced competitive stage. At this point, you have the raw information knowledge of stage 1, the interaction and common situation familiarity of stage 2, and the ability to make middle ground plays from stage 3. This now gives you the mental room to start working on more advanced strategies. You'll get better at long-term thinking, positioning, developing game plans, understanding player psychology, and much, much more. There are dozens of advanced skills like this that you'll pick up once you've mastered more basic ones. I won't go over them all, as that would make this video take forever, but if you want a more thorough breakdown of some of these advanced strategies, you can check out my Battling Guides playlist. In stage 4, it will also be easier to notice individual issues you struggle with. Maybe you have problems playing too passively, maybe you play too aggressive, maybe you're really bad at choosing which Pokemon to sack, or maybe you panic when you see certain threats. These kind of problems can be hard to spot when you're making more significant and tragic misplays, but as you get better, you can start to address these more subtle problems. So if you're at stage 4, how do you keep getting better? How do you improve as quickly as possible? Well, you could probably guess, largely it's nothing new. The biggest thing is just to keep making sure you're actively thinking. Like with the previous stages, autopiloting is the biggest risk to stagnating. Keep playing a lot of games on the ladder, keep actively thinking, and you definitely will keep getting better. There's already been a lot of repetition in this video, but I'll flash those graphics again so you can read through all of my recommendations for all the 4 stages if you want to. Now, obviously, every learning journey looks different. Some people will be much better team builders than others and take to it much more quickly. Some people will go way out of order on these stages. I've seen players that can't effectively make middle ground plays, but they have a great understanding of their opponent's psychology, or they're really good at positioning, skills that are usually refined later. I've seen players that automatically think in terms of middle ground plays, and they need to learn how to predict, when usually it's the other way around. Maybe you've somehow managed to make it to 1800 ELO without having any concept of middle ground plays at all. This video outlines what I consider the typical progression of skill in Pokemon, and the typical corresponding ELO ranges for most players, but there are bound to be tons of exceptions. In a game as complex and nuanced as Pokemon, there is no singular consistent path to becoming a top player. Even if these categories don't seem to fit you or your struggles, here are the main takeaways that you should get from this video. 1. Play a lot on the ladder. There is no better place to practice. 2, there is no substitute for just playing the game and battling. Guide videos, tutoring, watching top-level games, things of that nature can be helpful in small amounts, but if your goal is to get better faster, the vast majority of your Pokemon time should be spent on the ladder, playing games. 3, make sure you actively think. If you're ever clicking buttons without pausing to consider why, that's when your progress will slow a ton. If you're thinking, you're improving. If you're not thinking, you're basically just a bot going through the motions. If you remember nothing else from this video, remember these 3 things. And also, please keep in mind, the recommendations I make in this video are based on how to improve as quickly as possible, and I am not necessarily advocating for that. If you're at 1000 ELO and you have more fun when you build your own teams, do it. If the latter scares you and you'd rather play against people in the Pokemon Club at your school, do it. If you decide you just want to play Hyper Offense for a few months and nothing else because you're tired of thinking so hard, go for it. The tips in this video are not for everyone, just for the people that want to maximize the speed at which they improve. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and learned something. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. And if you have any questions, if something wasn't clear, or if you want more detail on something I mentioned, please leave a comment and I'll do my best to respond to them all. Well, that's it for today. Class dismissed.